Combat flow. Today we're gonna do all the logic letting us go in combat mode, iterate through all the units like it was their turn to act, and then end the combat. And in the meantime, we're obviously going to disable the debug menu because we don't want to be able to execute other actions than the actions that are supposed to be happening in the combat. So let's get to it. And to start the combat mode, we're simply going to add a button inside the debug menu, and then we can click on it to start the combat. So let's start by that. I'm gonna go in my debug menu, in my tabs, in tab combat, and open that one, and we're gonna add a button in there. And this is how I did it on my side. So I know there's a bunch of new components right here, but it's not that bad in the end. I just started by duplicating one of the other categories that I have right here. So I duplicated teams, I renamed it the combat instead of teams. And inside it, I've simply added a vertical box right here with a button and a few text components under it. So I have my button, we're going to start with that one. So it's a simple button with a simple text written on it. So I renamed the button Start Combat because it's the button to start the combat, obviously. And then I have 4 text components because we're going to have a few requirements to be able to start the combat, because we can't really start a combat at any time in the debug menu. Like, it will not make sense to just start the combat without any units on the grid, for example. So that's why we need 2 or more units on the grid. That's a requirement to start a combat. And then same thing, if we only have one team, well, we can't really start a combat and have one team fight against itself. That doesn't make sense. So we need at least 2 or more team on the grid to start the combat. And the last requirement is the most obvious one. We can start the combat if we are already in the combat. So we have to check if we are not already in the combat. So that's why right here I have 4 little text. The first one is just the title, and then I have 3 other requirements under it. The color don't really matter because we're going to change them in the code depending if the requirements are met or not. So right now I've set them to red and green, but it doesn't really matter. We're going to change them in the code. So here are my 4 text components. Just make sure that they are all variables because we're going to affect them by codes. So that's why we need them to be variables. So here it is. So I have my first one right here, start combat prerequisites. I have my second one, prerequisites underscore unit, underscore teams, and finally underscore not in combat. So here they are, and that's it. So now it's time to go in the graph. And actually, we can't really continue the logic of the tab combat just yet because we need to, in the combat system, create a function that is going to check all the requirements to be able to start a combat. Right now, we only have 4 text written in the user interface. They are not checking anything. So we need the logic to check all those requirements. So I'm going to go in my combat system. So in Blueprint, Core Combat, and open BP Combat System to create myself a new function to check all those requirements. Function that I named the can start combat. So we're just going to check if we can start the combat or not. So here it is. I have my 4 conditions at the end. So I'm returning if I can start the combat, if I have enough units on the grid, if I have enough teams to start the combat, and if I'm not in a combat. So here are the 4 booleans that I'm returning at the end, and I've also made the function pure, just so it's simpler to call afterwards. Then for the booleans, we're going to start with the enough units. So to check if we have enough units, we simply have to check the length of the units in combat. So if the length of the array units in combat is greater or equal than 2, it means that there's at least 2 units on the grid. So we have enough units. That's good. Then we're going to do the same thing for the teams. So if the unit teams, if the length is equal, greater or equal than 2, well, it means that we have enough team to start the combat. So that's good. For the fourth one, the not in combat boolean, this one is a little bit more complicated because right now we don't have any way to know if we are in a combat or not because the logic is not done yet, but we're going to do that today. So to do that, well, I'm just going to start by creating myself a new variable. So new variable right here. So I have my new boolean, which I named is in combat. We're going to use that to tell us if we are in a combat or not. So we have the boolean, and now that we have the variable that we're going to set later on in the code, we can simply check if it is not equal to true, which means that we are not in a combat. So is in combat, not, returns not in combat, which is going to tell us if we are in a combat or not. So that's good. So these are the 3 conditions that must be met to be able to start a combat. So that's why here for the can start combat boolean at the top, I'm just going to compare all of these. So I'm just going to do an and between all the conditions to make sure that they are all true. So if I have enough units, if I have enough teams, and if I'm not in the combat, together it means that we can start the combat. So here it is, we have the function. Great, we can compile, save the combat system, and go use it in the tab combat. And here I'm just going to create myself a new function, which I'm going to name update button and text. And we're going to use that function to update either if the button is enabled or not, and also all the colors of all of our text, depending on the conditions that are in the combat system. So let's get that one and call the new function can start combat. So when we call the new function, we now have access to all four booleans, and we're gonna use them to affect all the text component and the button component that we have right here. So first, we're gonna start with the button. We're gonna set it to enabled if we can start the combat. So we're gonna be able to click on the button only if we can start the combat. Otherwise, it's not going to be enabled, and we won't be able to click on it. So that's good. We can take the button, set is enabled on it. Perfect, that's done. Then for all the text component, we're gonna change their colors. So I'm gonna take my text component, which is the first one right here, the prerequisite, the default one, the one at the top, and we're going to set the color and opacity right here. We have a structure so we can split it, and for the color I'm just going to either select a green if we can start a combat, or a red if we can't start the combat. So here it is, that's how I'm setting the color for the first text component, and we're going to do the same thing for all the other ones. So I have my prerequisite unit right here, which is checking if we have enough units on the grid. So I'm just splitting the structure and connecting a select just like that. So if we have enough unit, it's going to be green, otherwise red. And then same thing for the other one. So I have the teams right here. I'm splitting the structure, connecting a select. So if we have enough teams, it's going to be green, otherwise red. And finally, the last one, set the color and opacity, split the structure, connect the select. Here we go. So now all of our text are going to be either green or red, depending on all the conditions. Perfect. So now we can compile save. This function should update all the text and the button, but it's never called anywhere. So let's go back in the event graph just to call the function. And here what I'm going to do right now is just take my new function, so the update button and text, and call it every time the unit teams on the grid have changed. Because every time we are updating the units on the grid, we are either going to be having enough units on the grid, not enough units, enough team, not enough teams. It's going to affect the state of all of our buttons and text. So that's why we are going to call it every time we are going to modify any units that are on the grid. So perfect. We can now compile and save. And I think that should be enough for a quick test before doing the next step. So I'm going to go in the level, press play. And here we can see that we have the three first texts red because the conditions are not met. So we cannot start the combat because we don't have two or more units on the grid and we don't have two or more teams on the grid. But we are not already in a combat. So the last condition is green. That's good. We can start a combat because we're not in a combat. But we need to meet the other conditions. So first we have to add at least 2 units on the grid. So here we go. I have 2 units on the grid right now. And the second condition, the first condition, the second line of text is now green because we have 2 or more units on the grid. But they are all of them, all my 3 units are in the same team. So it doesn't work. We have to create another team. So I'm going to create the team 2. Why not? Here we go. So now I can click on my start combat button because all the conditions are now met. We now have 2 or more units on the grid and 2 or more teams on the grid. And if we remove, let's say, some units, we can see that it still works. And if I remove one of my teams, we can see that we now have not enough units and not enough teams on the grid. And we can re-add or remove units to see that all the conditions seem to work in all conditions. So good, it seems to work. Now I should be able to click and start my combat, but we don't have the code that starts the combat quite yet. So that's going to be the next step. So I'm going to stop and go in the combat system first. So here we're going to start by creating ourselves a new function to start the combat. So here it is. I have my new function start combat, and we're going to keep the logic super simple for now. So the only thing we're going to do is just setting the boolean to say, okay, we are starting the combat, so we are now in combat, obviously. So that's it, the logic is done. But there's one other thing that I want to do, and it is to call an event dispatcher, a callback, to notify the whole game that the combat just started. So I'm going to create myself a new event dispatcher, which I named onCombat started. So we're going to notify the game that the combat started, and we're going to simply call it after setting the boolean. So we're setting the boolean, we're setting, okay, we are now in the combat. We're going to do all the other logic we need to do in between later on in the video, and then we're going to notify the game, okay, we are now in combat. Perfect. But now we're going to do the exact same thing, but to end the combat. So let's start by creating a new function to end the combat. So here it is. I have my end combat function. Then inside the function, we're going to keep it super simple, simply setting the boolean to say, okay, we're not in combat anymore. And then we're going to do the same thing with the callback. So let's create a new event dispatcher right here. I named it onCombat ended, and we're simply going to call it after setting the boolean. So now we're going to notify the game when we start the combat and notify the game again when the combat is ended. Perfect. So now let's compile and save the combat system. We now have all the events we need to go in the combat and go out of combat. So let's go start by handling that in the debug menu first. So I'm going to go in my tab combat to connect all that. And here I'm just going to start by shuffling a few things around to give myself a bit of space. So I'm just going to start by deleting the sequence. We're not going to use that anymore. And we're just going to move all these functions together right here under the callback. So that was the callback for the unit teams changed. And after doing that, we're going to do the callback callback for when the combat starts and ends. So we're just going to give ourselves a bit of space to do that right here. And here what I'm going to do is just hook myself to the on-combat started callback. So here it is, the combat started, we can hook ourselves to it, and then we're going to do the same thing for the on-combat ended. And for both those callbacks, we're going to connect them to the same event. So I have my new event right here, on-combat started or ended, because we're going to do the same thing. We just want to refresh the user interface. So we don't need to create two or multiple events for that. We can just call the same one, which is simply going to call the update buttons and text. Here it is. So now we can update the user interface every time we start and end the combat. The last thing we need to do for it to work is to reconnect those two functions at the end, because we want the user interface to be always up to date at the beginning of the game. So I'm just going to copy those two functions and paste them at the end, just right here. So now we are connecting ourselves to both callback, and then once we're done, we're just going to refresh the user interface, making sure that it is up to date. Perfect. The last thing we need to do right here to test all that, to make sure that when we start the combat, everything works and the text gets updated, is to actually start the combat, because right now we're never calling the start combat function. So let's do that real quick. And to do that, we have to implement the clicked event on the button start combat. So here it is. I have my clicked event. I can implement it right here. And then when we click on the button, we can simply get the combat system and call the start combat function just like that. So when we click on the button, we can now start the combat. Perfect. We're gonna compile, save, and go see in game if it works. So I'm gonna play, go in my combat tab, add a few units on the grid until we can start the combat. Right now we can't, so we can't click on the button. So I'm gonna start the combat. I'm gonna add a new unit to be able to start combat. And now if I click on the button, here we go. I'm now in combat. My text were updated. It says that I'm not already in combat, so I'm already in combat, so I cannot start the game. So I cannot click on the start combat anymore. So that's good, it works, I'm now in combat. But there's a few things now. We can still add units on the grid, so that's wrong. All the actions are still enabled. We can like tweak the grid as we play, so that's pretty weird. We have to remove that. And also there's no way to get out of combat mode right now, so that's not good either. So we have to fix both those things, and that's what we're gonna do. So to disable the debug menu, actually we don't want to disable it completely. We still want to be able to debug the game, because that's why we have the debug menu. But we don't want the player to be able to select another action than the actions that are related to the current combat. So that's why we're just going to deselect the action that is currently selected by the player, and then prevent him from selecting another action from the debug menu. So I'm gonna go in my core, in my player, and open the VB player action first to deselect the current action. So to do that, I'm gonna go in the begin play and hook myself to the new callbacks we added inside the combat system when the combat starts and end. So I'm just going to give myself a little bit more space right here to connect my two new callbacks right there. And here they are. So I have my callback for when the combat starts and the callback for when the combat ends. So here they are, and they are connected to two new functions I created on the left. So I have my new on combat started function, which is connected to the combat started, and the on combat ended function, which is connected to the combat ended, obviously. And for those two functions, it's super simple. Like I'm gonna go in there. When the combat starts, we want to deselect the current action. So I'm setting both actions to none. So no actions are selected by the player when the combat starts. And same thing for the units and the tiles. So I just want to deselect everything and start fresh for the new combat. So that's good. We're deselecting everything when the combat starts, and we're gonna do the exact same thing for when the combat ends, actually, because it's possible that during the combat we have a new action that is selected. We want to ask the player to, let's say, move a unit or attack with a spell with a unit or things like that. We're gonna have actions selected, so we want to deselect them when the combat ends. And same thing for the selected tile or unit, because the player is going to select the unit that he wants to move. So that's why he might end up with a unit selected. So we're just going to deselect it at the end of the combat, just so everything is reset by default. Good. So now we are able to deselect the current action when the combat starts and the current unit. So we are ready to start the combat, but during the combat, the player is still able to select another action. So if I go back in the tab combat right here and I go in the designer, we can see that we have all these buttons right there that the player can click on and select a new action. So what we're going to do is just disable all those buttons every time the combat starts and re-enable them when the combat ends. That way, the player is not going to be able to select a new action every time. So we're going to go do that directly in the button. So here I'm going to select the first button at the top, the select tile unit, and I'm going to go in the top right corner and click on edit button action just to open the asset for us. So now we are inside the button underscore action. Let's go in the graph to add a bit of code, and I'm going to do that inside the construct. So I'm going to go in the construct, add myself a little sequence right here, just to be able to execute some code on the right without changing everything else. So I'm gonna go at the right here to execute a little bit more code right there. And here the first thing we're gonna do is to retrieve the combat system from the world because we don't have a variable for it right now in this blueprint. So I'm gonna get an actor of class for the combat system and save it inside a new variable that I created right here. I have the new variable combat system. Perfect. So now we have the variable and we can hook ourselves to the new callbacks we created. So the onCombat started and onCombat ended. Both of them are going to be connected to the same event, the same way we did inside the tab combat. So now the onCombat started or ended event is going to be called, and every time that event is going to be called, we're either going to enable or disable the button action depending if we are in combat or not. So if we are in combat, we're going to disable the button action, and the opposite. If we are not in combat, we're going to enable it. So here we go. Now we should have all the button action disabled in the game when we are starting a new combat. So let's try that. I'm gonna play, I'm gonna add a few units on the grid and change my team to add another unit. Here we go. Now I can start a combat and we can see that now the buttons are all disabled. I cannot click on them, I cannot select a new action, I cannot execute the same action that I was already executing, and none of that is possible anymore because I'm in combat. So only the actions that are dictated by the combat system are going to work. So that's good. The same thing for the spell tab. I cannot execute those actions. Same thing for the pathfinding. These actions are disabled also. And same thing for the grid. Perfect. But actually that's not it, because here in the tab grid, actually we can still change the shape of the grid during the combat. The code works, it adapts itself. Actually, I'm not sure it destroyed a few units, so that's not good. Actually, yeah, that's not what we want. We don't want to be able to readjust the grid while the combat is running. We can see that it can mess up everything in the combat. So what we're going to do is just disable all those actions also when we are in combat. So let's go do that in the tab grid real quick. So I'm going to go in my debug menu, in my tabs, and open the tab grid right here. And we're going to do that in the graph, in the construct. So I have my construct right there. I'm going to do the same thing at the end. So somewhere around here, I'm going to add the callback to disable those actions when we are in combat. So I just gave myself a little bit more space, and now what I'm going to do is go back in the button action to select all those nodes and copy them, and then go back in the tab grid to place them right here at the beginning, right before the delay. Perfect. We can connect all that together just like that. We need to create ourselves the variable for the combat system. So right click, create variable. Here we go. And now we are connected to the callbacks and everything is called as expected. But now we have to decide what we want to disable or enable in the tab grid, because we don't want to disable the button action. Doesn't make sense. Let's delete that. And then we're going to go in the designer to see what we want to disable or enable. And what we want to change is those things. We want to disable the location, the tile count, the tile size, the offset from ground, the generate based on the environment, the shape of the grid. We want to disable everything that is inside the grid generation tab. So what I'm going to do is select the vertical box right here. We have all the options inside the vertical box. So if we disable the vertical box, it's going to disable everything at the same time. So let's do that. I'm going to rename the vertical box. So vbox underscore grid generation. And then I'm going to go in the top right corner to check it as the variable. So we have access to it in the code. So let's compile, go back in the graph. Now the component is available on the left, right here. So I can grab it and drop it inside the set enable. So this component is now going to be either enable or disable, depending if we are in combat or not. So it's going to disable all the actions at the same time. So perfect. Let's go back in the tree and see how it looks. I'm in my tab combat. I'm going to go in the grid just to see and make sure that the actions are still working. So the options are still working. We can affect the grid and everything, and that's good. That's perfect. That works as expected. Now in the combat, I'm going to add a few units in a few teams to be able to start the combat. So now I'm going to start combat. And now in the grid, we can see if we go back that all the options are disabled, and we are now not able to modify the grid while we are in the combat, which makes sense because we don't want to regenerate the grid when the combat is running. Perfect. But we still have access to all the other debug info if we want to debug the game. So that's good. Everything works as expected. Perfect. But now it's nice and all. We can go in the combat. We are disabling the debug menus and all the functionalities that we don't want to have during the combat. So that's great. But we don't have any ways to get out of combat. We're stuck in the combat, and that's not great. So we have to create ourselves a new button just to get out of the combat. And actually, that one's going to be different because we're not going to add it inside the debug menu, because during the real game, we're going to have a combat menu. We're going to have a user interface that is displayed during the combat, which is going to contain all the spells, the units, a button to skip your turn, a button to surrender the combat or end the combat or things like that. So what we're going to do is create ourselves a new menu that we're going to display during the combat, which is going to be the combat menu that we're going to use in the final game. So to do that, let's just start by stopping the game and going in the combat and create ourselves a new folder for the widget. So in the combat folder, I'm going to create a new widgets folder, and inside that widgets folder, I'm going to create myself a new widget blueprint that I'm going to name w_combat. Here we go. We now have the new widget to display in the game when we are in combat. So let's open that one. And for that one, it's going to be super simple for now. So I'm just going to start by replacing the canvas panel by an overlay, just because I prefer the overlay. And inside the overlay, I'm going to add my button, the new button I want to have to end the combat. So here it is. I pasted it in the bottom left corner. So if I zoom on it, we can see it better. I have my end combat button. So we have the overlay, we have a border just to have a little edge around the button, a little darker background, and then I have my button, which is a simple button with a simple text on it, and that's it. Just a simple button to end the combat. Here we go. Now let's compile and save the widget, and we're gonna implement the event to stop the combat. So let's select the button, go all the way down on the right, and implement the unclicked event, just like that. And here the idea is simply to call the end combat function that is inside the combat system. But right now we don't have a reference to the combat system. We are not aware that it exists in that widget. And since this widget is going to be reused by the real game, it's not going to be part of the debug menu, we don't want to do a get actor of class because that's not the right way to do it. We want to feed the combat system to the widget directly from the place it was created. So it's going to be created inside the player action because it's going to be displayed on the screen of one specific player. So inside that player action, we're going to spawn the widget, and at the same time, we're going to feed it the combat system that is used by this player. So that's why we need to feed it to the widget instead of just getting it from the world, because that's not the right way to do it. So let's create ourselves a new variable for that. So I have my new variable, which I'm going to name player actions, because we want to feed it the whole player, because it's going to be visible on the screen of one player. So why not just passing it the whole player as is? So here it is. I'm going to make it of type player action, obviously, so BP player action, and I'm going to make it instance editable and exposed on spawn, just like that. That way we can feed it super easily when we create the widget. So perfect. Now we have access to the player action inside this widget, and what we can do is just getting the combat system inside the player action and then calling the function end combat. So end combat, here we go. So now when we click on the end combat button, it's going to end the combat for us. Perfect. So now let's compile that and save. Now the widget is created, but we need to feed it the player action, and actually we need to also show it on screen. So let's go do that in the player action, as I said, and we're going to show it inside the combat started function. When the combat starts, we're going to display the combat widget. And to do that, well, it's super simple. We just have to first create the widget, because the widget doesn't exist. We have to create it. So create widget w_combat, and then since we have this class and the variable is exposed on spawn, we can feed it the player action right away. So feed it the player action using self, because we are currently inside the BP player action. So that's good. The widget is created and it is initialized properly. Perfect. Now I'm just going to save it inside a variable. So I created myself a new variable right here on the left, w_combat, that I can set, so we can reuse it later on if we want to talk with the widget, and then we can display it on screen. So add the two-player screen to display it on the screen, obviously. So now the widget is on screen, and that's good. We start the combat widget is visible. Perfect. Now we just have to go back in the combat ended function, because we don't want the widget to always be visible on screen. When the combat ends, well, we want to destroy the widget. We don't need it anymore. So let's destroy it. I'm going to start by doing that. Remove from parent on the widget, which is going to destroy it. And then since it's destroyed, we can simply reset the variable, because the variable is not valid anymore. So I'm just going to reset it to nothing. So set the variable back to nothing. Here we go. Now we can compile save, and the widget should now work in game. So let's go see. I'm going to add a few units, start the combat as usual, and then start combat. Here we go. Now we can see that the widget spawned because I have my new button in the bottom left corner and combat right here. That's good. The debug menu is disabled because I'm in combat, but if I click on the end combat function, we can see that now I'm not in combat anymore and my debug menu is back. I can now do anything I want. I can add more units. I can remove some units. I can, let's say I have to have multiple teams and start another combat, and now I can not do anything anymore because I'm in combat. So I can just end the combat if I want to, change a few things around or whatever, and then I can start another combat, and then end combat, start combat, end combat, start combat, end combat, and we can see that it works fine. So great, we are now able to start and end combats, no problem. And good, now we're at the halfway point of what I wanted to do today. So we are able to go in the combat, go out of combat, and the next step it will be to iterate through all the units because we want to do a turn-based system. So let's iterate through all the units one by one like it was their turn to play. So let's do that real quick. We're not gonna add any complicated logic in there for today. We're just going to do the flow, and then in the next few videos, we're going to add more codes in those functions. But first we have to create the function. So I'm gonna go in the units. So we're gonna start there, open BP units and create 4 new functions. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And here they are. So I have 4 functions, and they are just to simulate the flow of the combat. So I have the combat started function, which is going to be called at the beginning of the combat. Maybe we want the units to do something at the beginning. Do we want them to play an animation? Do we want them to move into places or whatever? We can do that and inside that function. So that's why I have it right here. We're not gonna add any logic in there for today. So that's why I just have a print string written I'm in combat. So now we know that the units are in the combat, but we're not going to add anything more complicated to that today. It's just so we can call it and see that it works. It's just to verify the flow of the combat. Same thing for the turn started function. If we want to execute code at the beginning of the turn of a unit, so maybe reset its movement point, action point, or things like that, we're gonna be able to do that in that function. But for now, we just have a print string that says it's my turn, so we know that the unit, it's now its turn to play. And then same thing for the turn ended function. So turn ended, sleep time, which is just a print string that I added, so we can see that it works. And finally, combat ended is the same thing, vacation time. So now it's the time for the unit to take a vacation because the combat is ended and it doesn't have anything else to do today. So that's good. These functions are just so we can see that the flow is working. We're gonna call them, but we're not gonna use them today. We're gonna use them in the future videos. I think in the next one or the one afterwards, whatever, we're gonna use them. Don't worry about that. So let's save that, and then we can go in the command system to call them now. And here we're going to start with the 2 simplest one because we already have access to the start combat and the end combat functionalities, so we can just feed them directly to the unit. So let's go in start combat first, and I'm going to give myself a little bit more room by moving the callback at the end further down the function, and I'm going to loop through all the units that are currently in combat to call the combat started function. So we are going to tell them one by one, okay, your combat started, your combat started, your combat started, and once that's done, we can call the combat to notify the rest of the game. So that's done for the combat started, and we're going to do the same exact thing for the end combat. So I'm going to go in end combat, move the callback a little bit further down, do my for each loop right here to loop through all the units and call the combat ended function that are inside the units. So good, now these functions are called, so that's good. But now we need a way to iterate through all the units, and right now we don't have a feature to do that, so we have to create it. So we have all the units that are in the combat, and we are going to iterate through all of them one by one. But to do that, we need a way to know which units we are currently using. And to do that, I'm just going to create myself a new variable, which I'm going to name a current unit. And it's going to be of type BP unit. And we're going to use this unit to do all the logic of the combat. So that unit is going to be the only unit on the grid that is allowed to do any action, because only one unit can do actions at a time. So that's good. We have the unit, and now we can go through all the units using that unit as a reference point. And we're going to create a new function to do that. So a new function, which I'm going to name next unit, and it's going to be responsible to go from the current unit to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, until the combat is over. So for the logic of the function, well, I'm going to start by adding a sequence because we have 2 steps to do. We have to first tell the previous unit that its turn is over. So we're going to tell it, okay, your turn ended. That's it. We don't have much to do about that. And then the second step is to tell the next unit, okay, it's your turn now. So first step is to tell the current unit that its turn is ended. So if the current unit is valid, well, we're just going to tell it, okay, your turn is ended. That's it. We don't have much else to do. Okay, that's done. And now for the second step, we need to know which is the current index of the current unit. If we want to be able to increment and go to the next unit, well, we need to know its current index. So I created myself a new local variable right here, a current index variable that I'm going to set by using a find on my units in combat. So we're going to look inside all the units that are currently in combat to find the current unit and let's say its index is 5. So we have the 5th index in the array. So now we want to go to the 6th one. We want to go to the next unit. So that's why we have to first get the current index to be able to increment it. And then during the increment of the index, we're going to reset the current unit using the new index that we find. So in the units in combat, we're going to get the new index, which we're going to do by simply getting the units in combat and getting the next index inside the array. So we can simply do that by doing a current index plus 1. So if we are at the 5th index in the array and we want to have the 6th one, well, we just have to do 5 plus 1. It's going to give us the 6th index, so that's good. But there's one little thing that we have to do right here. We have to do a modulo to make sure that the index doesn't go over the limit, the length of the array. Because let's say you have only 5 indexes in your array and you are already on the 5th one. If you do 5 plus 1, it's going to give you 6, which is not inside the array. The array only have 5 elements, so you cannot go to 6. That's why if we add a modulo right here, it's going to go back all the way to 0. So it's going to loop through the first unit again. And that's exactly what we want in our case, because when we are at the last unit and we go to the next unit, we want to go all the way back to the first unit because we want it to loop forever until the combat is ended. So it's going to do 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until the combat ends. So that's why the modulo right here is perfect for us. So that's good. We now have the current unit that is set to the next one or the first one in the array if we are at the end of the list. And then we just have to tell it, okay, it's your turn now. So tell it, turn started. And while we're here, I'm just going to take a bit of time just to create 2 new event dispatcher just to notify the rest of the game that the current unit changed. So when the unit ends its turn, we're going to notify the rest of the game. And same thing when the unit starts its new turn. So they are pretty simple. I have the onUnit turn started, which I'm passing a unit as input, so a BP unit in the top right corner right here. And then for the second one, I have the onUnit turn ended, which I'm passing it a unit as input also. And we're simply going to call them when we end the unit turn and start the new unit turn. So let's do that real quick. I'm going to call the onUnit turn ended right here, passing it the current unit to say the game, okay, this unit's turn is over now. And then for the turn started, I'm just going to call the onUnit turn started, passing it the current unit. Perfect. So now that's done, we can compile and save. And actually, there's just one last little thing that I want to do in the combat system today. So let's go do that real quick, and then we can just close the combat system completely. So let's go in the start combat first. And what we're going to do right here is to select the first unit in the combat, because when the combat starts, a unit has to play, and we have to select the first one. That's just how it's going to be. So after we call the onCombat started, and the game knows that the combat is about to start, we're simply going to select the first unit. So let's do that just like this right here. So I'm just going to start by resetting the current unit just to make sure that no unit is selected and it doesn't break the code in the case that there was a bug somewhere that set the current unit outside of the combat for some reason. So that's why I'm just resetting it right here, so just to make sure it's clean. And then we're going to pass to the next unit. So we're going to select the next unit, which is the first one in the list. Perfect. And the second thing I want to do is in the end combat, I just want to make sure to reset the current unit just to make sure that no units are selected when the combat is ended. Here we go, just like that. Now we can compile, save, and we're done with the combat system. So we can just close it. And now to be able to test all that, we're going to add ourselves a new button in the widget combat. So I'm going to go in W combat. In the overlay, I'm going to add myself a new button. So right here in the bottom right corner this time. So I have my new end turn button, the same thing as the previous one. So I have a border and I have my button, which is with a simple text in the middle. So here we go. Now with my button, I'm going to implement the event onClick. So onClick event. And what I'm going to do is simply going to call the next unit function inside the combat system. So get the combat system, do a next unit to call that new function. And now we should be able to test and see if it works. So I'm going to press play in the game and I'm going to add myself a few units. So I have a warrior right here and I have a priest, doesn't really matter. I'm going to clear the log because that's the only way we're going to see if it works. And I'm going to start the combat. So now it prints in the log, I'm in combat. I'm in combat for both units, so C0 and C1, and then I have the it's my turn for C0. So the first unit is ready to play, and then if I do our end turn, we can see that the C0 turns ended, so it's written sleep time, and then it's written it's my turn again for C1, and if I do an end turn multiple times, we can see that it starts the turn, and the turn, start the turn, and the turn, start the turn, and the turn over and over and over until the combat is over. And actually, if I click end combat, we should see that both units are now in vacation because the combat is over. Perfect. So now that seemed to work. And what we're going to do now, because we're not really able to see which unit is ready to play, which unit turns it is. So what I'm going to do is go in the player action to hook myself to the 2 new callback we created just to select the unit that is currently playing so we can see which unit it is. So I'm going to go in the event graph right here where we have our other callbacks so we can connect ourselves to the other ones that we just created. Just like that. So here I have my onUnit turn started callback, which is connected to the new function I just created. So onUnit turn started, the new function in the player action, and same thing for the onUnit turn ended, which I connected to the onUnit turn ended function right here. For both those functions, it's super simple. I'm just going to go inside the onUnit turn started first, and I'm simply selecting the unit that is currently playing. So I'm receiving the unit as input, I'm taking its index and selecting the tile, which is going to also select the unit. So that way it's going to be simpler to see which unit turn it is. And then in the onUnit turn ended, if I open that function, it's the opposite. I'm just deselecting the unit that was currently playing. So every time that function is called, we're simply going to reselect the index -99, -99, which is an invalid index. So it's going to simply deselect everything. Perfect. Now we can compile and save the player action. And if we go back in the game, we should more easily be able to see which unit turn it is. So I'm just going to add 2 units on the grid right now and do a start combat. So now we can see that my warrior is highlighted in blue. And if I press enter, we can see that now my slime is highlighted in blue. So now I can toggle between them and we can see more easily which unit is currently playing. So good. That's done. But before ending today's video, I think it would be also nice to have a bar that tells us which unit turns it's going to be. So after the warrior, it's the slime, and after the slime, it's going back to the warrior and things like that. So it would be nice to have a bar in the combat widget to see which unit turns it's going to be in the future. So let's just stop that and go create the new widget we're gonna need for that. So I'm gonna go in my combat widget right here and create myself a new user interface widget blueprint, which I'm gonna name w_combat_unit turns bar, and we're gonna add our units in there. So let's open that up. And this is how my widget looks. It's super simple. It only has the 2 components in it. So I have first a size box, which I'm going to use to limit the width of my component of my widget. So even if the units button are super big, it's only going to take 100 units wide. So that's good. It's going to limit the width of the bar. And in there we have a scroll box in which we're going to add all of our units. So if we have 10,000 units in the game, well, we are going to be able to scroll with the scroll box to see all of them. Otherwise, it will take way too much space in the screen, so it will not work. So here it is. I have my scroll box _ unit that I renamed, and I've also made it a variable because we're going to add all the units in the scroll box in code when they are added in the combat. And actually, that's the time to do that. So I'm going to go in the graph to add the units in there. And actually, we're not going to do anything directly in the graph right here. So let's just delete all that. And before we can do anything in this widget, well, it's going to need to know which combat system it's using and which player action it's using. Because if you remember, in the widget combat, we were feeding the player action at the beginning when we are creating the widget. So we're going to do the exact same thing for this widget right here. So let's create the variable first. So a new variable of type VP player action that I'm going to name player actions. And then I'm going to create myself a new function to set that variable. So new function, which I'm going to name set player actions, and we can feed it the player action as input. So I'm just going to use it to set my player action just like that. And then we're going to do everything else that we need to do in this widget. And that's how it goes. So we simply get the combat system from the player action and hook ourselves to the onUnit themes changed, because every time the units themes change, the units that are currently in the combat are going to change, and the order is probably going to change also. So what we're going to do is update the unit turns bar, which is a new function that we just created right here. So a new empty function that matches with the callback. So a new function right here, update the units turn bar, and then we are simply going to call it every time the units themes are going to change in the game. And while we're here, we also want the widget to be updated at the beginning of the game. So I'm simply going to call the update units turn bar at the beginning. When we are setting the player action, we also update the unit turn bar, so it is updated properly at the beginning of the game. Perfect. Now let's go do the logic of that function. So let's open it. And for the logic, it's pretty straightforward. The first step is to clear the children of the scroll box, because if we already added some units in there, we want to clear them and start over. So that's what we are doing. Then we can get all the units that are currently in the combat system and loop through them using our for each loop. For all of those units, we're going to create a new button _unit, so a new widget that we're then going to add inside the scroll box. But first we want to set the unit type so it has the right visual. So I'm going to get my unit type from my unit, set it inside my button so it has the right visual, and then finally we can add it inside the scroll box. So now all of our buttons for all the units are added inside the scroll box and should be visible on screen. Perfect. We should now be able to save and compile this widget and go add it inside the widget combat. So I'm going to go in the designer and add it right here. And that's how it looks. It's super great. We can zoom to see all the details because there's a bunch of details in there. No, not really. I just have the same border as the other one, so I just copy pasted the same border as my other two buttons. And then in there, I just added a W with combat underscore widget turn bar, which I have right here. So here it is. I have my new turn bar. It doesn't have anything in there just yet, but we're gonna go connect them in the graph just so it's going to get populated in the game. So let's go in the graph, and what I'm gonna do is go in the construct just to feed it the player action. So right here at the beginning, when we are creating the widget combat, we're just going to take the player action and feed it to the unit bar. Perfect. Now we can come back, save, and we can go in the game to see how it looks. So I'm gonna add a few units in there. So in a few teams, I can add multiple units just to see if they appear properly in the user interface. So here they are. And now if I start the combat, we can see that, yeah, on the right here, I have my warrior, then I have a priest, a chicken, a slime, a chicken, and then a bat. And then if I go in my turn order, if I go next, we can set it follows the same order. So it seems to work properly. Great. And now, before ending to this video, there's two last little things that I want to add, and it's just polish. It doesn't change any of the functionalities, but what I'm going to do is first add a little border around the current unit, so we know which unit it is currently playing in the turn bar on the right. And also, I think it will be nice that if I move my cursor over one of the units in the game, so let's say the slime right here, it will show in the unit bar that is that specific slime, because if we have 10 slimes on the game right now, we will not see any difference in the progress bar in the unit bar on the right. So I'm just going to highlight which one I'm overing in the case that we are overing units on the grid. So let's go do that real quick, and then we are going to end this video. So I'm going to start by going in the BP units. I'm going to need two new callbacks. So let's create two new event dispatcher. So I have my on unit over change callback, which is going to notify anything else in the game when the unit is overed. So I'm just going to pass the unit as input right here in the top right corner. And then I have my on unit selected change, which is going to do the same thing, but for the selected state. So in the top right corner, I'm passing the unit as input. Here we go. Now we're going to go call these two new callbacks inside the functions set is overed and set is selected. So let's start by the set is overed, and at the end of the function, we can simply call the on unit over change, just like that, passing itself. And then in the set is selected, we can do the same thing. So on unit selected change, we're going to call it and passing it the self also. So good, now we can compile and save the BP unit. And now what we want to do is when the unit is overed or selected, we want the button in the user interface to react. And to do that, well, we have to go modify the button of the unit. So let's go in entry. I'm going to go in my units, which are right here in the widgets, and open button underscore unit to make it react when the unit is overed or selected. So let's go in the graph to do that. But right here, right now, this button is not aware that the unit exists. We can only feed it a unit type, which is good, but it's not good enough. We really want to connect the button with a specific unit that is on the grid right now. So what we're going to do is create ourselves a new variable to be able to feed it the unit. So I'm going to name it unit. It's going to be of type BP unit right here. And I'm going to make it instance editable and exposed on spawn so we can feed it easily. And now what I'm going to do is go in the construct right here just to modify it depending if we received a unit as input or not. So we're just going to start by moving this out of the way to have a little bit more room to add a sequence at the beginning of the construct, and we're going to check if we receive the unit as input. So if the unit that we receive as input is valid, it means that we just received one. So the first thing we're going to do is overwrite the unit type that we also received as input, because if the unit type is not the same as the unit type of the unit we received, there's actually a problem there. So we're just going to overwrite it. That way it's going to always match and always fit together, which that's exactly what we want. So that's good. And then the two next things we need to do is to simply connect ourselves to the two new callback we created. So we have the on unit over change right here, which we create an event to it. And then we have the on unit selected change right here. And for both of those, we're just going to create a matching event. So right click on the function, create matching event that I'm going to rename a little bit later. And I'm going to do the same thing for the other one. So select it, create a matching event just like that. So now I'm just going to move them right here, and I'm going to rename them and do their logic. And here they are. So when we are overing the unit, so I rename the event on unit hover change, what we're going to do is simply change the render scale of the button. So when the user passes his mouse over the unit, we're going to scale the button a little bit bigger. So let's say 10%, and then it's going to go back to the right size. That way we're going to have a little bit of feedback when the user is moving his cursor over a unit. And finally, we have for the selected, we just have the on unit selected change right here. We are simply going to also select the button. So it's going to add the little blue border around the button, and that should work good enough. So that's great. The last thing we need to do in this widget is inside the pre-construct again at the end. I just want to make sure that the button is always up to date as soon as it's created. So what I'm going to do is simply call my two new event we created. So on unit over change and on unit selected change at the beginning. That way the button is going to be always up to date at the beginning. Perfect. Now we can compile save this button. We're done with it. And we just have to go back in the widget combat unit turn bar just to set one last thing. And it is right here when we are creating the button widget. If you don't see it, we can now pass it the unit as input. If you don't see it, you can just refresh the node and it should appear. But right here we have the unit that we can simply pass from the for each loop just like that. And actually, since we are now passing the unit directly, we don't need to feed it the unit type because it's going to overwrite it anyway, so that doesn't matter. So now the button is aware of the unit actor that is currently on the grid, and that should be it for today's video. So let's go see how it. And here we go. So here on the right in the unit turn bar, we can see that we have all of our units, and the first one is selected. So we have the blue border around it because it's its turn to play. And now when I move my mouse over the units on the grid, we can see that they are getting a little bit bigger in the scroll bar, and we have a little bit more feedback on which unit it is. Great, and now if I do end turn, we can see that the border around their units goes to the next one because it's their turn to play. So it seems to work, and I guess that's gonna be it for today because we did a lot of things and we're gonna continue to improve it in the next one. So I'm gonna see you then. Bye bye!